Some people don't walk into the mountains to find peace, they go there because they've run out of reasons to stay. The road ended 2 miles back, swallowed by a narrow trail of frozen dirt and scattered pine needles, and Elias Boone hadn't bothered looking in the rearview mirror since. His old pickup sat alone where the gravel gave out, its engine ticking softly as it cooled, like a tired heart refusing to fully rest. He had taken only what he could carry, a worn canvas pack, a dented thermos, and a folded letter he hadn't opened in years but couldn't leave behind. The air grew thinner as he climbed, each breath sharper, colder, filling his lungs with something that felt almost like clarity, or maybe just emptiness shaped differently. Snow clung to the ground in uneven patches, crunching under his boots, the sound echoing too loudly in the stillness, as if the mountain itself were listening. Elias moved steadily, not fast, not slow, just forward, the way he had learned long ago when stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. His shoulders were broad, but they carried a quiet heaviness that had nothing to do with the pack on his back. Years had carved lines into his face, not deep, but enough to tell a story he rarely spoke out loud. His dark hair, threaded with early gray, stirred in the wind as it slipped between the trees, whispering through branches like a voice that never quite formed words. By the time the sun began to lower behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the slope, Elias reached a clearing that overlooked a narrow valley below. The view should have been beautiful. Pine forests stretched for miles, their dark green tops dusted with white, and a frozen stream cut through the land like a pale ribbon. But beauty required a kind of presence he no longer knew how to hold. He stepped closer to the edge, boots pressing into the brittle crust of snow, and for a moment, he simply stood there, staring out at the distance as if it might answer something he hadn't yet asked. The wind shifted, colder now, brushing against his face, tugging lightly at his jacket, as though urging him to move or perhaps to stay, he couldn't tell which. His hand slipped into his pocket, fingers brushing against the folded paper, but he didn't take it out. Not yet. Not here. The silence around him deepened, settling into his bones, familiar and heavy, the kind that had followed him home from places he rarely allowed himself to remember. It was the kind of silence that could swallow a man whole if he let it. And for the first time in a long while, Elias wondered if that was the point. He took one more step forward, just enough to feel the edge beneath his feet, the ground uncertain, the world opening wide in front of him, and in that fragile, suspended moment, when everything seemed to hold its breath along with him, a sound broke through the stillness. A single bark. Not loud, not frantic, but clear, steady, and close enough to feel real. Elias froze, his gaze shifting slowly away from the valley and back toward the line of trees behind him, where the fading light turned shadows into shapes that almost moved. The wind stilled, just for a second, as if even the mountain was listening now, and then it came again. Another bark. This time softer, but somehow closer. Not a call for help. Not a warning. Something else. Something that didn't belong to the silence he had come here to find. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Elias Boone took a step back from the edge. The sound did not come again immediately, and for a moment Elias wondered if the mountain had played a trick on him, the way silence sometimes twisted into echoes when a man stood too long with his own thoughts, but then a faint movement shifted between the trees, subtle but unmistakable, a darker shape against the dimming light, and his body reacted before his mind did, turning fully away from the edge as his eyes searched the tree line with the same quiet focus that had once kept him alive in. Places far from here, places where every sound mattered and every pause could mean something waiting just out of sight, he stood still, listening, not just with his ears but with that deeper instinct he had never quite lost, the one that measured distance, weight, intent, and the space between breaths, and then the shape stepped forward, slow, deliberate, not hiding, not rushing, just emerging from the shadow of a tall pine as if it had always been there and had simply chosen this moment to be seen. It was a dog, large, its frame lean but not weak, its coat a mix of muted gray and pale cream dulled by dirt and snow, patches of fur clumped from cold and time spent outdoors, and yet there was something steady in the way it carried itself, something grounded, as if the wilderness belonged to it in a way Elias never could. The dog stopped about 20 feet away, close enough for him to see the sharp line of its ears and the alert stillness in its posture, but not so close as to threaten or beg, and that was what struck him first. It did not whine, it did not lower itself, it did not ask for anything. It simply stood there, watching him with a gaze that felt almost too aware, amber eyes catching what little light remained, reflecting it back in a quiet, unbroken focus. Elias let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding, his shoulders easing just slightly as he studied the animal, noting the faint limp in its front leg, the way its ribs showed beneath the fur but not sharply enough to mean it had been starving for long, and the thin line of an old scar along its shoulder, the kind that had healed but left a story behind, a story not so different from his own. "You are a long way from anywhere, buddy," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse, the words hanging in the cold air before fading into the stillness. But the dog did not flinch at the sound, did not retreat or approach, only tilted its head slightly as if listening not to the words but to something underneath them. The wind shifted again, softer this time, brushing through the trees with a low murmur, and Elias felt that strange pull return, not toward the edge this time, but toward the space between himself and the animal, a space that felt less like distance and more like a question waiting to be answered. Slowly, he reached into his pack. Careful, unhurried, pulling out the last of the jerky he had brought with him, his movements deliberate, open, the way you approached something that could either walk away or stay depending on how you chose to meet it. He crouched slightly and set the piece of food down on the snow a few feet in front of him, then straightened again, taking a step back, giving the dog room, not forcing the moment, just allowing it. For a few seconds, nothing happened, the two of them standing there as the light continued to fade, the cold deepening around them, until finally the dog moved, one careful step, then another, its limp more noticeable now but not slowing it much, its eyes never leaving Elias as it approached the food, paused, and then lowered its head just enough to take it, not snapping, not rushing, just accepting. It chewed slowly, lifting its gaze again almost immediately as if the food had never been the point, and in that quiet exchange, something shifted, small but undeniable, like the first crack in ice that had been frozen too long. Elias exhaled softly, the tension in his chest easing in a way he had not expected, and for reasons he could not yet explain, the silence around him no longer felt as heavy as it had just moments before, as if the mountain itself had made room for something new to enter, something neither of them had planned, but both somehow understood. The last light of the day slipped behind the ridge, leaving the clearing wrapped in a blue-gray stillness that felt deeper than night, and Elias knew he could not stay exposed on the slope much longer, the temperature already dropping fast enough to bite through layers, the kind of cold that did not rush but settled in quietly until it owned the ground beneath your feet. He glanced once more at the dog, who now stood a little closer than before, not pressing forward, not retreating, simply existing within that invisible boundary that had begun to form between them, and for the first time in a long while, Elias did not feel the urge to walk away from something that had found him. He shifted his pack higher on his shoulder and turned slightly toward the tree line, scanning for shelter the way he had done countless times before, eyes tracing the land for shape, for break, for anything that might hold back wind and night, and after a few seconds he spotted it, just beyond a cluster of tall pines, a low structure barely visible through the branches, its outline uneven but solid enough to suggest walls, maybe a roof still holding. He hesitated, then took a step in that direction, and after a moment, he heard it, the soft crunch of snow behind him, not hurried, not hesitant, just there, the dog following at its own pace. They moved together without agreement, without command, two separate paths slowly aligning as the forest closed around them, the scent of pine thickening in the cold air, the ground dipping slightly as they descended into a shallow hollow where the wind lost some of its edge. The structure came into view more clearly now, an old hunting cabin or maybe a ranger outpost long forgotten, its wood weathered to a gray that blended with the surrounding trunks, one side of the roof sagging slightly but still intact, the door hanging crooked but not fallen. Elias approached slowly, testing the ground, listening, always listening, and the dog stopped just short of the doorway, its ears lifting, body still, as if something inside the cabin held its attention more than the man beside it. Elias noticed that, the way the animal's focus shifted not outward but inward, and something about it stirred a faint unease, not fear, but awareness, the kind that told him this place was not entirely empty in the way abandoned things usually were. he reached the door and pushed it gently, the hinges answering with a low, tired creak that echoed into the dim interior, and the air that met him was cold but still, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something else he could not quite place, something that lingered beneath the surface like a memory waiting to be recalled. Inside, the space was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a narrow bench along one wall, a rusted stove in the corner, and a scattering of objects left behind in no clear order, as if someone had once meant to return but never did. Elias stepped in, boots thudding softly against the worn floorboards, his eyes adjusting as he took in the details, the lines, the weight of the place, and behind him, after a brief pause, the dog crossed the threshold as well, its movement quiet but deliberate, its presence filling the room in a way that made it feel less hollow. Elias set his pack down and moved toward the stove, crouching to inspect it, his hands working automatically, checking for anything that might still function, anything that could give them a little heat before the night deepened further. And as he worked, he became aware of a sound, faint but distinct, not from outside, not from the wind, but from somewhere within the cabin itself, a soft, uneven tapping, like something lightly touching wood at intervals too steady to ignore. He turned his head slowly, listening harder now, and saw the dog standing near the center of the room, one paw lifted slightly, its gaze fixed downward at the floorboards beneath it, ears forward, body tense but not afraid, as if it had found something it had been searching for long before Elias ever arrived. The tapping came again, quiet but certain, and Elias felt that same shift inside him, the one that had pulled him back from the edge, now drawing him forward into something he did not yet understand, something waiting just beneath the surface of a place that had not been as empty as it first appeared. The tapping came again, soft but deliberate, and Elias felt it settle somewhere deeper than sound, like a memory trying to surface through wood and dust, and he rose slowly from the stove, his movements careful, almost respectful, as if whatever waited beneath the floor deserved more than a careless step. The dog did not move when he approached, only shifted its weight slightly, its lifted paw hovering just above the same spot, eyes fixed with a quiet intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition. And Elias found himself pausing beside it, looking down at the worn planks where time had left faint cracks and uneven seams, the kind that came from years of settling, or from something beneath pressing gently upward over a long stretch of silence. He crouched, placing his hand flat against the wood, and for a moment there was nothing, just the cold surface and the faint vibration of the wind against the cabin walls. But then he felt it, barely there, a subtle tremor, as if the cabin itself had a heartbeat too slow to notice unless you were waiting for it. He drew in a quiet breath, his fingers tracing along the seam where two boards met, and there, almost hidden in the grain, was a mark, not carved deeply but deliberate enough to remain, a small symbol, worn but still visible, a shape he recognized without fully understanding why, something tied to a world he had left behind but never truly escaped. The dog lowered its paw and pressed it gently against the same spot, then looked up at him, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a simple understanding that this was not random, that whatever lay beneath had been waiting longer than either of them had known. Elias leaned back slightly and scanned the room, eyes adjusting again, searching for anything that might help him open the floor without tearing it apart, and his gaze settled on a rusted pry bar resting near the wall, half buried beneath a thin layer of dust and old debris, as if it had been left behind for a purpose that had never been fulfilled. He reached for it, the metal cold in his hand, its weight familiar, grounding, and returned to the spot where the dog stood, positioning the tip carefully along the seam, testing the wood before applying pressure. The first movement was small, a slight shift accompanied by a low creak that echoed softly through the cabin, and he paused, listening, not just for sound but for change, for anything that might tell him whether he was opening something meant to stay closed. But the air remained still, the silence unchanged, as if the cabin itself was allowing it. He pressed again, more firmly this time, and the board lifted just enough to break free from its place, revealing a narrow gap beneath, dark and still, holding a depth that seemed greater than the thickness of the floor alone. The dog stepped back slightly, not in fear but in awareness, its eyes following every movement as Elias worked the board loose, setting it aside carefully, then another, until a small section of the floor opened into a shallow compartment hidden beneath the cabin, the space no more than a foot deep but enough to hold something intentionally placed and carefully concealed. Inside lay a metal box, rectangular, worn by time but intact, its surface dulled to a muted gray, edges softened by years of stillness, and for a moment Elias simply stared at it, the weight of the discovery settling slowly into his chest, not as excitement, but as something quieter, something that felt like the beginning of a question he had not known he needed to ask. The dog moved closer again, lowering its head toward the opening, its breath steady, calm, as if whatever this was had already been accepted long before Elias had arrived, and he reached down, his hand hovering just above the box before finally making contact, the cold metal grounding him in the present, reminding him that this was real, that the mountain had not only pulled him back from the edge but had led him here, to something hidden, something waiting, something that felt less like coincidence and more like a path unfolding one careful step at a time. The metal was colder than the air around it, as if it had been holding the memory of winter long before Elias ever stepped into the cabin, and for a moment he did not lift it, his hand resting on the surface, feeling the stillness beneath his palm, a stillness that did not feel empty but preserved, like something carefully kept waiting for the right hands to return. The dog remained beside the opening, its breathing slow and steady, eyes fixed not on Elias but on the box itself, as though its purpose had always been tied to this exact moment, and that quiet certainty settled into Elias in a way he could not explain, easing something inside him that had been tight for longer than he could remember. He finally wrapped his fingers around the edges and lifted the box free from its hidden space, the movement deliberate, respectful, as if he were handling more than just an object, and set it gently on the worn floorboards beside him. It was not large, perhaps 12 inches wide, 8 inches deep, and no more than 6 inches tall, its surface scratched and dulled by time, but intact, sealed with a simple latch that had not been opened in years. He studied it for a moment, his gaze tracing the faint lines and marks that spoke of age and travel, and then he noticed it, a small engraving near the corner, barely visible beneath the wear, a set of initials carved carefully into the metal, followed by a date that had long since faded but still held its shape. Something about it stirred a distant recognition, not a memory he could name, but a feeling, the kind that came from standing too close to a past that had not fully let go. The wind brushed softly against the cabin walls, a low whisper that moved through the cracks like a breath, and Elias glanced toward the door for a brief second before returning his attention to the box, the present pulling him back with quiet insistence. He released the latch slowly, the metal giving way with a faint click that echoed softly in the small space, and then he lifted the lid. Inside, there was no gold, no stacks of money, nothing that would have meant anything to the world beyond these mountains, only a few simple items placed with care, as if their value had never been meant to be measured in anything other than memory. At the top lay a folded piece of cloth, neatly kept despite the years, and beneath it a small leather-bound notebook, its edges worn but preserved, along with a photograph that had yellowed with time. Elias reached first for the photograph, lifting it carefully, his fingers brushing against the surface as he turned it toward the fading light. It showed a man standing in front of this very cabin, younger, stronger, dressed in the same kind of worn jacket Elias himself now wore, and beside him stood a dog, almost identical to the one now at his side, the same alert posture, the same steady gaze, as if time had bent in on itself and returned something that had never truly left. Elias felt his breath slow as he studied the image, the weight of it settling into him, not as confusion, but as something deeper, something that felt like a connection forming across years he had not lived. He lowered the photograph slightly and glanced at the dog beside him, and for a brief moment, the resemblance between the animal in the picture and the one standing there was impossible to ignore, not just in appearance but in presence, in the way it held the space around it with quiet purpose. The dog met his gaze without hesitation, calm, grounded, as if it had always known where it was meant to be, and Elias felt something shift again, a subtle but undeniable change, like the beginning of understanding that did not need to be explained. He set the photograph down gently and picked up the notebook, its leather cover cool against his fingers, the edges softened by years of use, and as he held it there, unopened, he realized that whatever story waited inside had not been left behind by accident. It had been placed here, protected, hidden, waiting for someone who would not simply find it, but feel it. Outside, the last of the light faded completely, and the cabin settled into the quiet of night, but inside, something had awakened, something that reached beyond the walls, beyond the mountain, into a space where past and present no longer felt separate, and for the first time since he had begun the climb. Elias Boone did not feel like a man who had come here to disappear, but someone who had been brought here for a reason he was only just beginning to understand. The notebook felt heavier than it should have, as if the years inside it carried more weight than paper and ink ever could, and Elias did not open it right away, his fingers resting along the worn spine while the cabin settled deeper into the quiet of night. The kind of silence that did not press against him anymore but seemed to sit beside him, steady and patient. The dog lowered itself onto the floor a few feet away, front paws stretched forward, head upright, watching not with urgency but with a calm that felt almost knowing, as though whatever was about to be uncovered had already been accepted long before Elias ever arrived. A faint draft slipped through the cracks in the wall, stirring the edge of the folded cloth inside the box, and Elias finally exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the moment before opening the notebook with careful hands, the leather bending softly as the first page revealed itself under the dim light filtering through the cabin window. The handwriting inside was steady but unpolished, the kind of writing that came from someone who cared more about truth than form, each line pressed into the paper with a quiet intention, and Elias found himself reading without realizing when he had begun, the words pulling him in not with urgency but with familiarity. The entry was dated many years back, the ink slightly faded but still clear, and it spoke of a man who had come to the mountains not to explore but to escape, a man who believed that distance could silence what followed him, only to find that the silence spoke louder than anything he had left behind. Elias felt a subtle tightening in his chest as he read, not from shock but from recognition, the kind that came when someone else had already walked a path you thought was yours alone. He turned the page slowly, the paper whispering under his touch, and the entries continued, each one tracing a quiet transformation, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, shaped by small moments that seemed insignificant on their own but carried something deeper when placed together. There were mentions of long winters, of wind that howled through the trees like a voice trying to be heard, of nights spent staring at the ceiling with thoughts that refused to settle, and then, gradually, there were mentions of a dog, a stray that had appeared one day without warning, standing at the edge of the clearing much like the one that had found Elias, watching, waiting, not asking for anything but never leaving. Elias paused, his gaze lifting from the page to the dog beside him, and for a moment the distance between past and present felt thinner, almost transparent, as if the story written in his hands had not ended but continued, carried forward in ways he could not fully explain. He looked back down and continued reading, his breath quieter now, more measured, as the words unfolded into something more than memory, something that felt like guidance, though it never spoke directly, never told the reader what to do, only what had been lived, what had been endured, and what had slowly, almost quietly, begun to change. The man in the notebook wrote about how the dog stayed through storms, through silence, through the kind of days when even getting up felt like more than he could manage, and how, over time, the presence of that animal became something steady, something that did not judge or question, something that simply remained. Elias closed his eyes briefly, the weight of those words settling into him. And when he opened them again, the cabin felt different, not warmer in temperature, but warmer in something less tangible, something that reached beneath the surface of the moment. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, no longer sharp but almost rhythmic, like a distant breath rising and falling, and inside, Elias turned another page, his hands steady now, not because he had found answers, but because he had found something that felt closer to understanding. Something that told him he had not come here alone, even before the dog had appeared, and perhaps, just perhaps, he had not come here to end anything at all, but to continue something that had been waiting longer than he ever knew. The pages grew quieter as Elias turned them, not in the sense of fewer words, but in the way the voice within them seemed to settle into something deeper, something that no longer searched for answers but had begun to accept the weight of the questions themselves, and he felt that shift in his own chest. A slow easing that did not remove the ache but made space around it. The next entry was written with a steadiness that felt different from the earlier ones, the lines more deliberate, the words chosen with care, and as Elias read, he realized the man had known his time was nearing its end, not with fear, but with a kind of calm that came from having finally understood something that had once seemed unreachable. The entry spoke of the dog again, not just as a companion, but as a guide, something that had not only stayed but had led, quietly, persistently, toward places the man had not intended to go, places he might have avoided if left to his own will. Elias paused there, his eyes lifting slowly toward the dog beside him, who remained still, watching, not demanding attention but holding it in a way that felt impossible to ignore, and for a moment, the idea settled into Elias with a clarity that surprised him, that perhaps this animal had not simply followed him here, but had brought him. He lowered his gaze back to the page, his breath slower now, more grounded, as the words continued, describing a hidden place beneath the cabin. A place the man had discovered only after the dog had insisted, day after day, returning to the same spot, scratching, waiting, until curiosity finally overcame resistance. Elias felt a quiet recognition pass through him, echoing the moment just hours ago, when the dog had stood over the floorboards, unmoving, certain, as if guided by something beyond instinct. The writing went on to describe what lay beneath, not treasure in the way the world would define it, but something left behind with intention, something meant for the one who came after, not chosen by chance, but by something harder to define, something the man simply called trust. Elias turned the page slowly, the sound of paper soft in the stillness, and found the final entry, shorter than the rest, written with a steadiness that carried no doubt, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that settled into the space around him like a held breath finally released. It read like a letter, not to anyone specific, but to whoever would one day sit where Elias now sat, holding the same pages, asking the same questions. The man wrote that if you are reading this, then the dog has found you, and if the dog has found you, then you were not meant to be lost, no matter how far you walked or how long you believed otherwise. Elias felt his hand tighten slightly on the edge of the notebook, not from tension, but from something closer to disbelief, not in the words themselves, but in how precisely they seemed to reach into the place he had been trying to avoid. The entry continued, explaining that the cabin, the land, and everything within it had been left behind not as an escape, but as a beginning, a place for someone who had reached the edge and stepped back, whether by choice or by something else that could not be named. The wind moved softly outside, brushing against the cabin walls in a rhythm that felt almost like a quiet agreement, and Elias closed the notebook slowly, his fingers lingering on the cover as the weight of what he had just read settled into him, not as a sudden revelation, but as something slower, something that would take time to fully understand. He looked again at the dog, at the steady calm in its posture, the quiet certainty in its gaze, and for the first time, he did not see it as something that had appeared by chance, but as part of something larger, something that had been set in motion long before he ever decided to walk into these mountains. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because he had, even if only slightly, and as he sat there in the dim light, the cold no longer pressing as hard against the walls, Elias Boone realized that the edge he had stepped back from was not the end of his path, but the point where it had finally begun to turn. The night settled fully around the cabin, not as an emptiness but as a presence, something that wrapped the walls and the trees and the narrow clearing beyond in a quiet that felt almost deliberate, and Elias remained seated on the floor for a long moment after closing the notebook, his hand still resting on the worn leather cover as if letting go too quickly might cause something important to slip away. The dog shifted slightly, the soft sound of its movement breaking the stillness just enough to remind him that he was not alone, and when Elias finally looked up, he saw the animal watching him again with that same steady gaze, not expectant, not questioning, simply there, as if it understood that whatever came next would not be rushed. A faint groan echoed through the cabin as the wind pressed gently against the structure, and Elias rose slowly to his feet, his joints stiff from the cold and the long stillness, his body reminding him that time had not stopped even if the moment had seemed to. He moved toward the small window, brushing a thin layer of frost from the glass with the back of his hand, and looked out into the darkness where the outlines of trees stood like silent witnesses beneath a sky scattered with distant stars, their light faint but constant, the kind that did not demand attention but remained all the same. The mountain felt different now, not because its shape had changed, but because the weight he had carried into it had begun to shift, subtle but real, like a burden being redistributed rather than removed. Behind him, the dog rose as well, its nails clicking softly against the wooden floor as it crossed the room and stopped near the door, ears tilting slightly as if catching something beyond the reach of human hearing, and Elias turned at the sound, watching as the animal stood there, alert but calm, its attention fixed on the world outside. For a brief moment, the old instinct returned, the one that had taught him to read movement, to sense change before it arrived, and he found himself stepping closer, not out of caution but out of curiosity, the kind that had been buried beneath routine and silence for longer than he could remember. He opened the door slowly, the hinge answering with a quiet creak, and the cold night air slipped inside, sharper now but not unkind, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant snow, and something else, something faint but distinct, like the promise of change moving through the trees. The dog stepped just outside the threshold, its posture steady, head lifting slightly as it looked toward the slope beyond the clearing. And then it took a few steps forward before stopping and glancing back, not urgently, not insistently, but with a quiet invitation that felt impossible to ignore. Elias hesitated for only a second before following, pulling his jacket tighter around him as he stepped out into the night, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots, each sound clear in the stillness. They moved together across the clearing, the dog leading by only a few feet, not rushing, not pausing, simply walking as if the path ahead had already been chosen long before either of them had set foot on it. The trees parted slightly as they reached the edge of the slope, revealing a narrow view down into the valley where the frozen stream reflected the faint light of the sky above, and for a moment, Elias stood there again, near the edge, the same place where he had almost taken a different step, but this time the feeling was not the same, the pull no longer downward, but outward, towards something that extended beyond the narrow space he had confined himself to. The dog sat beside him, calm, grounded, its presence steady against the quiet vastness of the mountain, and Elias felt a slow breath fill his lungs, deeper than before, not forced, not heavy, just present. And as he stood there in the cold night, looking out over the land that had not changed and yet somehow felt entirely different, he understood that whatever had begun inside that cabin had not ended there. It had followed him out into the open, into the space where choices were made not from escape, but from something closer to acceptance, something that did not erase the past but allowed it to exist without defining the path ahead. Morning arrived slowly, not with a sudden burst of light but with a gradual softening of the darkness, the sky shifting from deep blue to a pale gray that spread quietly across the valley, and Elias stood just outside the cabin, his breath rising in thin clouds that faded into the cold air as if even they had somewhere to go. The night had passed without urgency, without the restless weight that used to follow him into every corner of silence, and though the mountain remained as vast and indifferent as ever, something within him had begun to settle, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to notice the difference. Behind him, a faint curl of smoke lifted from the small stove he had managed to coax back to life, a thin line of warmth marking the place he had almost never entered, and inside, the notebook rested beside the metal box, no longer hidden, no longer waiting, its story now carried forward in a way the man who wrote it might have hoped but never seen. The dog moved through the clearing with an easy, measured pace, its limp still present but no longer drawing attention, its body adjusting to the terrain as if it had walked these paths for longer than any single life could account for. And when it paused near the edge of the clearing, turning its head slightly toward Elias, there was no urgency in the gesture, only acknowledgement, as if to say the path was still there, but it no longer needed to be followed blindly. Elias stepped forward, the snow firm beneath his boots, each movement grounded, deliberate, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was walking away from something, but towards something that had not yet taken shape. He glanced once more toward the valley, the frozen stream catching the early light in a faint shimmer, and the memory of where he had stood the night before lingered only briefly, not as a pull, but as a reminder of how close he had come to choosing a different ending. He let out a slow breath, the air steady in his chest, and turned back toward the cabin, the simple structure no longer just a shelter, but something closer to a beginning, a place that had been waiting not to be discovered, but to be continued. The dog followed without command, its presence quiet and certain, and together they stepped back inside, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath their weight, the space holding a different kind of silence now, one that did not press or close in, but opened outward, like a room that had finally remembered its purpose. Elias moved to the table and picked up the notebook again, his fingers resting along the worn edges as he considered the pages yet to be written, not in ink, but in the choices that would follow from here. And though he did not yet know what those choices would be, the absence of certainty no longer felt like a void, but like space, something wide enough to hold whatever came next. He set the notebook down gently and looked toward the door, where the light of morning continued to grow, steady and patient, and in that quiet moment, with the mountains stretching beyond the walls and the dog waiting near the threshold, Elias Boone understood something he had not been able to see before, that sometimes the path forward does not begin with finding something new, but with realizing that what you thought was the end was simply the place where you were meant to start again. And as the first full light of day touched the cabin and everything within it, he stepped toward that understanding, not as a man who had been saved, but as one who had finally chosen to stay.